Hello, this is Pastor Rick. I want to welcome you to this special edition of the Sunday Forum, this Table Talk edition, as we talk about the trip to Rwanda. I'm happy to be back. It was a marvelous trip. I went with our faculty, with Howard Isaacson, as you know, with Clay Schmidt, who flew in from California, and of course I was along as well. And it was a glorious trip for many reasons, but particularly because our first graduates walked across that stage, got their diplomas.
Receive this hood, and you can take it home.
So for the first time, we have actual graduates as pastors with an MDiv degree. That is a first for us here at Emmanuel Academies. We'll have more graduates this year coming up, and you'll hear about them. But for the Lutheran Church in Rwanda, it was a big step forward. Because now, as those two graduates walked across the stage, Ruhinda Theonist and Makara Edward, they could look at the other students who are in the audience and say, you work hard this year, and then next January we might have another 8 or 9 graduates as well, including the Bishop Mugabu, who will be our first graduate as a D-Min, as a Doctor of Ministry. Here's part of the importance of the day. The Lutheran Church of Rwanda is growing. It has over 60 congregations, 40 pastors, of which 5 are women. That's important because we saw 2 of the women, the excellent work they were doing, had family ministries in their congregations. This church, who began speaking in French, is now speaking as its central languages, Kinyarwanda and English, which allows us to do education there. They are members of the Lutheran World Federation and the World Council of Churches. They are small within the Protestant world, but they are growing quickly. So let's frame that a little bit. Of all the Christians in Rwanda at the time, about 43.7% are Catholic, 37.7% are Protestant, 11.8% are Seventh-day Adventists. And we'll say more about that later because we helped the Seventh-day Adventists at the end of World War I. And 2% are Muslim, Sunni Muslim, which is the major Muslim denomination in the world. Okay, so among that 37.7% Protestants, the Lutherans are a small group, but growing and growing mightily in Rwanda. So to understand that and to put that growth of the Lutheran Church in context, 3 historical moments or events are important. And we'll talk about the missionary history of Lutherans in Rwanda. Then we'll talk about the genocide and the role the genocide has played in shaping and actually being a catalyst to start the church in Rwanda. And finally, 5 years ago, when the government demanded that all pastors have to have an MDiv degree or they can't call themselves pastors anymore. So let's go over those 3 events briefly. First of all, the Lutherans began at the turn of the 1900s to do missionary work in Rwanda. Catholics were there and Lutherans, often Germans, established the church, but because Germans lost World War I, they had to give up all their colonies, and therefore they had to give up all their churches. It was the Bethel Mission in Germany who had been the driver of some of those missions, coming over from Tanzania and coming directly from Germany. When they gave them up, they gave up their congregations and their people and their infrastructure to 3 groups. And the first was the London Missionary Society, which was evangelical but interdenominational. The second was the Presbyterian Church, close to the Lutherans. And the third was the Seventh-day Adventists. As I mentioned, they were 11.8% of the Protestant, or the part of the Christian church, but a lot of their initial infrastructure came from the Lutherans. And so, then comes genocide. Before the genocide, there are no Lutherans, as I said. But even before the genocide, there had been hate speech and people had been experienced violence. And so refugees had been going to Tanzania for years. And then with the genocide, there was just a flood of refugees. And they were received warmly, evangelized, collected in the congregations by the Lutheran Church in Tanzania. And so when these refugees, Rwandan refugees, came back to Rwanda, interestingly now they're speaking Swahili and they're bringing their faith with them, which was now Lutheran. And so they started bringing their congregations, there were a few pastors along, and now the Rwandan government was happy to have a new congregation, a new denomination, was happy to have the Lutherans because they had not been all tied up with the genocide. Now comes recently the government who says we welcome the Lutherans, but there are other churches we're not happy with, especially some of the evangelicals from the United States, because they were putting down women, which was contrary to what the government was trying to achieve. And so 5 years ago, the government pronounced that all pastors now had to have an MDiv education. They just didn't want fly-by-night congregations meeting in storefronts. Now you had to have a well-built church with all the infrastructure, and your pastors had to have advanced degrees. Well, this put a pressure on all the churches, but also the little churches like the Lutheran Church of Rwanda, and that's where Frank Lee makes his visit and talks with Edward Makara and says, we think we can solve that problem for you here in the Lutheran Church of Rwanda and for you personally.
Thanks for the invitation for Gene and me to tell the story of our trip to Rwanda, which was an unbelievable trip for me and for you as well, right? You
One of my best. One of the best.
And Rahel Williams came from Global Mission and said, we're doing a trip to the missions in Tanzania and Rwanda. Count me in. I said, she wasn't so excited, but she owed me one from another trip, and she said, okay, I'll go along. And so we ended up in Tanzania, flew in a day early, Gene and me, and settled in, and we thought we were just on our own little trip, not connected to God in the sense of doing any kind of pastoral ministry. And lo and behold, we went through Tanzania for like about 10 days, had a wonderful trip seeing Global Mission and what it's doing. I wish everybody could do it and see what it is, so your money would have some life to it. But anyway, when we got to Rwanda, at the end of the Tanzanian trip, we were equally impressed with this church that from Global Missions had gotten started, and I think it was 600,000, people already in the church, and it was only, maybe it was 6 million, but I think 600,000. And the president of the country was frustrated that some of the clergy were not being very faithful to their people, or kind of doing a success story instead. And so he made the rule that you had to have credentials, which that meant BD-Mins, doctors of ministry, or ministry, doctor of ministry, or just the masters of divinity.
Or be ordained.
Yeah, be ordained. Well, and then be ordained officially. And so it was ironical. This is the puzzle part. There's a guy by the name of Gordon on the trip who had helped a guy by the name of Edward in Rwanda get his undergraduate degree, and he was working 30 hours a week to be able to work for free as the pastor of a congregation. And he needed credentialing, and I was sitting there and I thought, my goodness, we can do that. Steve had this dream of raising up leaders. These people in Rwanda need leadership. No way did Steve think about these people. I didn't think about these people. But the Lord might be bigger than most of us. And so I started telling the story of what we were doing. And Edward got excited, and I told the bishop, and he was excited. Next thing I know, some more puzzle pieces goes in. Steve and Howard and Rick are off on the plane to go to Rwanda to celebrate their anniversary. And that cemented the deal, and now we're raising up leaders in Rwanda.
Edward Makara, he was one of the first students who graduated then this last week. And so now the Lutheran Church is trying to get all its pastors to get MDivs, or again, they could come under scrutiny and censorship by the government. So it's a big day. So the Lutheran Church is now promoting, highly educating their pastors, and they're stepping into the future so that these pastors will be well equipped and fulfill all righteousness, all the demands of the government. So what a big day as these two, Rohinda Theonesta and Makara Edward, walk across the stage. Clay Schmidt and I were there along with Howard to bless them, to give them their diplomas. We made the service with all the pomp and circumstances and robes and certificates. We wanted to make it as a big a day as possible because not only do the Africans enjoy good celebrations and pomp and ritual, but we did as well because it was a big day for them. It was a big day for Emmanuel. So I want to thank you for your support. That support has allowed us to achieve now our first 2 graduates, and we might have 7, 8, maybe 10 graduates next year as well as the church moves on in its ministry. I hope that you will continue to support Emmanuel Academies because in essence, when you support us, Emmanuel Academies, you're supporting these students. So thanks for joining us on this special edition, Table Talk edition of the Sunday Forum. Hallelujah, our first 2 MDiv graduates. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye now.
Nestling in the mountains in the heart of East Africa, Rwanda's forests, lakes and wildlife attracted visitors from all over the world. Once famous for its mountain gorillas and spectacular scenery, now Rwanda is remembered as the scene of one of the most brutal massacres in recent history. In 1994, up to 1.2 million people were killed. That's more than the population of Birmingham. The world community did little to stop the genocide, the attempt by people of one ethnic group to wipe out another, and the deep mental wounds that are still felt today. Rwanda borders Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the size of Wales, but it's home to more than 8 million people. There are 3 ethnic groups in Rwanda: the Hutu, the Tutsi and the Twa. At one time they were all united, sharing the same language and customs. However, during the 20th century in particular, tensions developed between the Hutus and the Tutsis. In 1899, Rwanda was colonised by Germany. After the First World War, the country came under Belgian control. The Belgians introduced identity cards which identified people by their ethnic groups. Traditionally, the Tutsis received better education than the Hutus, and the king was a Tutsi. However, marriages took place between Hutus and Tutsis, and people could improve their social position. The new identity cards made this more difficult. Opposition between classes of different geographical and racial origin developed. Hutu opposition grew particularly strong in the 1950s, and in 1959 the Tutsi king was overthrown. Many Tutsis fled the country. Deepening divisions between the two peoples came to a head in 1994, when Rwanda's Hutu president was assassinated. Although it was not clear who was responsible, it was used as an excuse to start a massacre of Tutsi people and Hutu moderates, for which the president had in fact been preparing for some time. Radio broadcasts encouraged the Hutu population to slaughter Tutsi men, women and children. Thousands of Tutsis fled the country. The killing only stopped when the Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Army took control of the country. At this time, around 2 million Hutus fled the country in fear of revenge. However, some then used the refugee camps as a base to attack Rwanda. In response, the Rwandan government supported the liberation of Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, and forced hundreds of thousands of Tutsi refugees to return to Rwanda. 10 years later, it is estimated that 2 million people have died in the massacres and what followed. The media may have turned their spotlight from Rwanda, but the desperate need for peace remains.